It was the winter of 1943. The air hung thick with smoke and frost, biting at the exposed faces of men who had seen more than any human should. The Russian front was a frozen graveyard, mud and snow blending into a gray wasteland under the dim, pale sun. Artillery fire echoed in the distance, a relentless, hollow drumbeat that never stopped. Somewhere, a shell hit a distant building, collapsing it with a sound like the world itself breaking. Corporal Sam Anders moved through the wreckage. His uniform was tattered, stained with both snow and blood, the bitter cold seeping through threadbare gloves. He carried a small satchel slung across his shoulder, its leather worn, the strap cutting into his neck with every hurried step. Inside were the tools of his trade: bandages, morphine, a few fragile vials of antiseptic. That was all. And yet today, it would have to be enough. The front line had shifted overnight. Enemy forces had surged forward, pinning down the battalion Anders was attached to. The fighting was brutal. Smoke mingled with the fog, making the trenches invisible until a sudden shell burst revealed them in stark relief. Men ran, shouted, and fell, their cries swallowed almost immediately by the thunder of artillery. Anders' heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the knowledge that behind every moan was a life that might slip away if he didn't act fast. He ducked behind a shattered wall, scanning the field. Soldiers lay sprawled, some clutching wounds, others frozen stiff with shock or cold. One young private, barely 16, trembled violently, blood seeping through his sleeve. Anders knelt, speaking in calm, steady tones, ignoring the bullets that whined past him. "You're going to make it. Keep your eyes on me. Just breathe." But the chaos was unrelenting. The ground shook as tanks rumbled across the frozen dirt, crushing everything beneath their tracks. Machine guns rattled in sharp bursts, sending men ducking for cover. Anders worked mechanically, efficiently, but each act of aid tore at him emotionally. Every wound reminded him of the fragile line between life and death. Every scream made the air itself feel heavier, suffocating. And then the orders came. The battalion was to fall back. The front had become untenable. Anders felt a moment of panic. Retreat meant abandoning the wounded. But he could not leave them, not one, not when lives depended on him. He took a deep breath, letting the cold slice through him, and made a decision that would define the next weeks of his life. He would stay. Using debris and whatever supplies he could salvage, Anders began establishing a makeshift hospital inside the ruins of a nearby farmhouse. Smoke curled from a small stove, its heat barely penetrating the frigid air. Wooden crates became tables, blankets became stretchers. Oil lamps flickered against the walls, casting long, anxious shadows. It was crude, it was dangerous, but it was life. Soldiers staggered in, some screaming, some barely conscious, all needing immediate care. Anders moved among them like a ghost of calm, a single steady presence in a world collapsing around him. He amputated, bandaged, comforted, and injected. He whispered prayers he didn't believe in, promises he couldn't guarantee. Every life saved was a victory. Every life lost was a wound he carried silently. As night fell, the bombardment intensified. Shells exploded closer now, shaking the building to its foundations. Anders' hands were raw and bleeding, his face streaked with soot and tears he did not shed. Yet he pressed on. One by one, he checked each patient, murmuring reassurances, administering pain relief, keeping hope alive where it seemed impossible.
And outside, the enemy pressed on, relentless, merciless, as if the world itself had decided to test the limits of human endurance. Inside, Anders worked in silence, focused only on the fragile pulse of life under his hands. He did not sleep. He did not rest. He simply existed in the tiny space between survival and annihilation, a single man against the tide of war. By dawn, the farmhouse had become a sanctuary amidst chaos. 200 men had passed through his care. Not all would survive, but many had a chance. And yet, Anders knew this was only the beginning. The front would move again. The battle was far from over. He stepped outside, the frost biting into his skin, and looked across the ruined landscape. Smoke hung like a shroud, and distant gunfire still cracked through the frozen air. He clenched his jaw, eyes scanning the horizon. The storm wasn't over yet, it was only beginning. The night had passed, but it brought no relief. Dawn was pale, almost colorless, and the frozen wind bit into exposed skin like steel knives. The battlefield was eerily quiet at first, but silence in war was a lie, a pause before the next wave of violence. Smoke curled in the distance, carrying the stench of fire and death. Anders tightened his coat, slinging his satchel across his shoulder. The farmhouse he had claimed as a makeshift hospital was no longer just shelter. It had become a fortress of hope amidst despair. Inside, the wounded shifted restlessly. Some moaned softly, delirium edging their voices. Others were silent, eyes wide open, staring past the ceiling into some distant memory. Anders moved between them, his hands steady despite exhaustion. He adjusted a bandage here, administered morphine there, whispered words meant to calm, but often faltered in his own throat. Every movement was measured, precise, because a single mistake could cost a life. The first bombardment of the morning hit just as Anders was checking a young lieutenant with a deep chest wound. The walls shuddered violently. Dust and plaster rained down from the ceiling, covering men and supplies alike. Anders froze only briefly, then sprang into action, hauling the lieutenant onto a makeshift stretcher, muttering curses under his breath at the world outside. Outside, the sound of artillery was a relentless drum, a symphony of destruction that threatened to drown out human screams. A scout arrived, breathless and wild-eyed. "They're coming! Infantry! Tanks! They'll reach us in an hour if we don't move." Anders' stomach twisted. They couldn't move the wounded. The farmhouse was their only refuge. Yet, he did not panic. Panic was a luxury for those who had the option to flee. He had neither option nor time. Orders were shouted from the few remaining officers, their voices hoarse with tension. "Hold them here! Do not let them take this position!"
Anders nodded, ignoring the cold that seeped through his bones. He moved quickly, securing the doors with whatever he could find: beams, crates, even bed frames. Then he checked his patients again, whispering reassurances in voices barely above a breath. Fear was contagious, but hope was contagious too, if only it could survive the storm. The first wave of the enemy hit just as the wind shifted, carrying the stench of mud and blood. Small arms fire rattled against the walls. Shells struck nearby, shaking the floor beneath them. Anders worked through it, hands moving faster than his mind, tying tourniquets, cleaning wounds, keeping men alive with a mixture of medicine and sheer force of will. One soldier, barely conscious, murmured, "Am I going to die?" Anders knelt beside him, holding his hand. "Not today. Not while I'm here. Not while you're breathing. You're staying with us." Minutes stretched into hours. The farmhouse became a cage of survival. Outside, men fought and died, but inside, life persisted against all odds. Anders found a rhythm: treat, reassure, bandage, repeat. His body ached, his hands were raw and numb. His mind raced, calculating, prioritizing, improvising. Supplies were dwindling, but he refused to let that dictate the outcome. Improvisation became his weapon as much as any rifle outside. By midday, the enemy had pressed closer. Through shattered windows, Anders could see tanks rolling toward their position, infantry advancing, faces grim and determined. He didn't allow himself to flinch. The farmhouse would not fall, not if he could prevent it. Then came the sound that froze his blood. The first explosion inside the building. A stray shell, a fragment of steel, tore through the roof. Dust and splinters rained down. Anders barely had time to react, grabbing a stretcher, shielding a soldier with his own body. The smell of smoke and cordite filled the air. Men screamed, pain echoed everywhere. And still he moved, still he saved. Hours passed like days.
Anders barely ate, barely slept. Every moment was a fight. Against time, against injury, against despair. Yet, despite the chaos, life persisted. One by one, he dragged men from death's edge back into the fragile light of survival. As dusk approached, the artillery fire slackened. Outside, the battlefield was littered with debris, smoke, and the moans of the wounded. Anders stood in the center of his makeshift hospital, surveying the damage. The farmhouse was battered, walls cracked, windows shattered, but it still stood. And so did his patience, alive against impossible odds. He sank to his knees beside a cot, finally letting exhaustion overtake him for a moment. His hands trembled, bloodied and numb, yet he whispered a silent vow. Tomorrow the fight would continue. Tomorrow more lives would need saving, and he would be there. The first day had passed, but the siege was far from over. The storm was only gaining strength.
The night came without mercy. Darkness crept into every corner of the farmhouse, seeping through cracks in the walls, under doors, between shattered window panes. Outside, the battlefield was silent in the deceptive hush that precedes another wave of violence. Anders moved between the cots by the light of a single lantern, its glow flickering against walls streaked with soot and blood. Every shadow seemed alive, every creak in the floorboards a threat. Supplies were dwindling faster than he had calculated. Bandages ran low, morphine was nearly gone, antibiotics were a memory. Anders checked his stock again, counting each item with grim precision. With 200 lives to guard, every drop, every strip of cloth, every pinch of antiseptic mattered. He felt a rising panic, the kind that clawed at the edges of reason, but he swallowed it down. Panic could kill as surely as bullets. The wounded shifted, moans rising from the cots in a chorus of suffering. Anders paused beside a young infantryman, his face pale under grime and frostbite. "You'll make it," he whispered, tying a bandage tight around a deep leg wound. "I'll keep you alive." The soldier's eyes fluttered open for a moment, filled with trust and fear, before closing again. Anders gritted his teeth and moved on, ignoring the tremor in his own hands. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery started again. Anders could feel it through the floor, in his chest, in his bones. Smoke spiraled into the night sky, black against the waning moon. He knew that with every passing hour, the enemy was closing in, surrounding the farmhouse like predators circling a wounded animal. A sudden crash near the back wall made him freeze. Through the smoke and flickering lantern light, a figure appeared, a young medic from the neighboring unit, face streaked with dirt and blood. "Supplies," the medic gasped, handing over a small box of bandages and a few doses of morphine. Relief and guilt collided in Anders' chest. They were barely enough to make a difference, but they would have to suffice. The night deepened. Anders moved with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Every movement, every decision had weight. A slip here, a hesitation there, could cost a life. His mind raced through triage scenarios, prioritizing those who could survive if treated immediately. Each choice was a knife twisting in his gut. Who would live? Who would die? Then came the first cries of infection, high fever, delirium, signs that the wounds had turned toxic. Anders didn't flinch. He worked tirelessly, cleaning, dressing, stabilizing. He applied pressure to those who bled, whispered prayers over those who moaned. He improvised. Strips of cloth became bandages, whiskey became antiseptic, blankets were layered to stave off frostbite. By midnight, the farmhouse had transformed. It was no longer just a shelter or hospital. It had become a lifeline, a haven of human persistence amid the chaos. Anders moved from cot to cot, face set in grim determination, ignoring his own exhaustion. His eyes burned, hands bled, muscles screamed, but he pressed on. Suddenly, the door rattled violently. Footsteps, shouts. The enemy was at the perimeter, testing, probing, seeking an entrance. Anders froze for a heartbeat, listening to the sounds of soldiers outside, rifles clinking, orders shouted in harsh tones. He tightened his grip on a wooden chair. ready to defend not with bullets, he had none, but with sheer willpower and barricades.
A shell struck nearby, shaking the walls. Dust and splinters rained down, covering wounded and medics alike. Anders shielded a group with his own body, shouting orders above the roar of destruction. "Keep them calm. Stay low. We hold here." Hours passed like minutes, each second stretching into eternity. The farmhouse groaned under the assault of nature and man alike. Yet inside, Anders and his makeshift team kept life moving forward. Every life saved felt like a victory, every death a wound in his soul. By the first light of dawn, a quiet settled over the battlefield. The enemy had withdrawn temporarily, leaving destruction in their wake. Anders sank against a wall, exhausted to the marrow, and surveyed the scene. Cots overturned, bandages used beyond measure, and yet, still, most of his patients breathed. He whispered to himself, voice hoarse, "We're not done yet. Not yet. Not while there's a single breath left." The storm had passed for now, but Anders knew it wouldn't be long before it returned. Supplies were still scarce. The enemy would press again, and the lives of 200 men rested on his shoulders alone. The day had broken, but the battle for survival was far from over. Morning light spilled into the shattered farmhouse, weak and pale, falling across splintered furniture and blood-stained floors. The wind carried the distant echo of gunfire and artillery, a reminder that the battlefield was never truly silent. Anders rose unsteadily from where he had collapsed against the wall. His body ached from hours of constant motion, from carrying the wounded, from shielding lives that were not his own. But the ache was nothing compared to the gnawing weight in his chest. He moved among the cots with methodical precision, counting heads, checking breathing, noting the pale and the fevered, marking each patient with silent symbols in his mind: stable, critical, beyond saving. 2 men had succumbed overnight. He had not cried, there was no time, but their absence burned in him like a hot iron. Each death was a reminder that time, supplies, and human frailty were against him. The knock on the door came suddenly. Anders spun around, heart racing, expecting the enemy. Instead, a young private from a nearby unit entered, clutching a small box of medical supplies, bandages, morphine, a few vials of antibiotics. Relief surged, tempered instantly with dread. It was only enough for a handful of patients. He would have to make choices no one should ever be forced to make. He knelt beside a young soldier whose leg was nearly severed from shrapnel. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, lips trembling. "Will I," stammered he, "will I make it?" Anders swallowed hard. He did his best, his voice tight but steady. Inside, his mind raced. If he used the morphine and antibiotics on this boy, there would be nothing left for the others who were equally in need. He moved to the next cot, a sergeant, older, seasoned, but suffering from a deep chest wound. Anders pressed a hand to his side, feeling shallow breaths, and knew that without immediate intervention, the sergeant would not survive another hour. The reality hit him like a punch. There was no way to save them all. He had to choose. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he made the first selection. He administered the last vials of morphine to the young soldier, cleaned the wound as best he could, wrapped it tightly, whispered reassurances he didn't fully believe. Then he turned to the sergeant, stripped sheets and blankets for warmth, and applied pressure to slow the bleeding, improvising with splints and torn clothing. He worked faster than ever, muscles burning, mind narrowing to pure focus.
Outside, the sounds of the approaching enemy grew louder. Patrols moved closer, the sharp staccato of rifles cutting through the morning air. Anders could feel the danger pressing at the walls of the farmhouse, a physical weight threatening to crush him. But he ignored it, focused entirely on the impossible calculus of survival before him. Hours passed in a haze of urgency. Anders moved from cot to cot, each patient presenting a new crisis, each decision a knife twisting in his chest. A soldier moaned from fever, a medic cried out for assistance he could not provide. The farmhouse became a theater of desperation, each life a fragile candle flickering against the storm outside. By mid-afternoon, Anders sank to the floor, leaning against the wall, face streaked with soot and sweat. He listened to the labored breathing around him,
The quiet sobs, the small victories of a pulse held, a fever stabilized, a wound dressed before it turned fatal. He allowed himself a single shaky breath. Then came the shout. Enemy soldiers had breached the outer perimeter. The farmhouse would soon be under fire again. Anders rose, hands shaking, body screaming in protest, and moved to organize his defenses. He knew that even if he survived the next assault, the moral weight of his choices would not leave him. But he pressed on, because to falter now meant more deaths, more screams, more lives snuffed out in a war that showed no mercy. Each decision, each impossible choice, was a testament to human endurance, a measure of courage forged under impossible circumstances. As night fell again, Anders stood in the center of the farmhouse, surveying the wounded, the makeshift supplies, the walls trembling under distant bombardment. The enemy would return. So would the storm of moral decisions. And somewhere in the midst of chaos, the lives of 200 men hung on the choices of a single medic. He whispered, voice barely audible over the wind, "I will not fail them. I cannot. Not now." The night deepened, thick with fear, yet Anders' resolve burned brighter than any lantern. The battle for survival had only just begun, and the next wave of terror would test the limits of his courage like never before. The night was alive with distant explosions, each one a pulse in the darkness. Anders crouched beside a cot, hands steady despite fatigue, fingers pressing against the soldier's wound to slow the bleeding. The farmhouse groaned under the weight of the storm outside, but the storm within was louder. The relentless beat of gunfire, the echo of screams, the gnawing fear that at any moment the enemy could break through. A window shattered suddenly. Glass sprayed across the floor like tiny daggers. Anders flinched but did not stop. The boy on the cot whined softly, eyes wide with terror. Anders leaned closer, whispering, "Stay with me. Just stay with me." Outside, the sound of boots pounding on frozen earth announced the approach of enemy soldiers. Shadows flickered under moonlight, rifles glinting. Anders knew they had minutes, maybe seconds, before the farmhouse would become a death trap. He moved quickly, assessing the wounded. Some could not move, others were too weak to lift. Improvisation became instinct. Blankets became stretchers. Doors became shields. Every scrap of wood, every chair, every broken table was weaponized to create barriers, to protect the lives within.
A sudden burst of machine gun fire tore through the wall near the main entrance. Anders dove to the floor, dragging a bleeding private with him. The boy screamed, but Anders' hands worked with brutal efficiency, pressing wounds, tying makeshift tourniquets. He had no time for fear, no room for hesitation. From the corner of his eye, he saw one of the older soldiers, barely conscious, struggling to lift a cot. Anders lunged, helping him maneuver it against the wall to shield another patient. There was no room for argument, no time for debate. Survival demanded obedience, demanded sacrifice, demanded that each man do the impossible. Minutes stretched like hours. The enemy prowled outside, grenades thrown, rifles aimed, the farmhouse trembling with each impact. Anders moved through the chaos like a ghost, touching each patient, stabilizing, whispering encouragement, sometimes lying when he didn't believe it. A young private had taken shrapnel to the abdomen. Anders gritted his teeth and worked with a scalpel and a broken spoon, stitching as best he could. Blood slicked his hands, mixing with sweat, ice, and grime. Time blurred. Outside, the enemy forces grew bolder, pounding doors, smashing windows. Then came a lull, unnatural, intense. Anders froze, listening. Every sound carried, every heartbeat was a warning. Somewhere, a soldier whispered, "They're coming through the back." Without hesitation, Anders grabbed a lantern, signaling a few of the stronger soldiers. "We move them, now!" He directed with sharp commands, lifting stretchers, dragging wounded through narrow passages, improvising exits through broken walls. Every second mattered. Every choice could mean life or death. The farmhouse erupted in chaos once more. Anders' makeshift hospital became a battlefield in miniature. He could hear his own pulse, the ragged breathing of the injured, the distant shouts of the enemy. Yet he continued, unstoppable, a force of endurance and determination. By dawn, the worst of the attack had passed. The farmhouse was scarred,
walls pockmarked with bullets, furniture smashed, windows shattered, but nearly 200 men had survived the night. Andres collapsed against a broken table, eyes scanning the room. Every face told a story: fear, pain, exhaustion, but also gratitude, life preserved against all odds. He looked out through a jagged hole in the wall at the pale morning light. The battle had taken its toll. His hands were raw, his back ached, his mind a whirl of exhaustion and relief. Yet he knew this was only a reprieve. The enemy would regroup. Supplies were low. Help was far. And still, his patience needed him. Anders whispered into the quiet, almost a prayer, almost a vow. We survived the night, but the war is not done. Not for any of us. The storm of fire, blood, and sacrifice had passed for now, but the next battle, both outside and within the hearts of the wounded, was just beginning. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the snow-covered fields. The farmhouse, once a refuge, now stood as a hollow shell, its walls riddled with bullet holes, its roof scarred by shrapnel. Anders surveyed the scene, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The survivors stirred, shivering, faces ghostly in the weak light. Supplies were low, morphine nearly gone, bandages tattered, food limited to hard biscuits and a few tins of cold rations. Anders counted heads. 200 men. Too many to stay in one place. The decision was clear. They had to move, across open terrain, under the eyes of the enemy, to a safer location deeper in the forest. He organized the wounded into groups. Those who could walk, barely, were instructed to stagger behind, wrapped in blankets. Others were loaded onto sleds, makeshift stretchers, improvised carriers. Each movement was slow, deliberate, calculated. Every step on the ice was a gamble, every breath a battle against frostbite and exhaustion. The first mile was quiet, too quiet. The snow crunched beneath boots, the wind whispered like a predator. Anders' eyes scanned the horizon constantly. He could see the smoke of enemy patrols curling in the distance. Any misstep could mean ambush, death, or capture. Then a sudden shot cracked, a distant rifle, followed by another. Anders dropped to the snow, dragging a sled behind him. Soldiers followed his lead, flattening themselves against the frozen ground. He hissed instructions in short bursts. Low, move, keep them covered.
The wounded groaned, the snow biting their skin. A young corporal clutched his side, blood seeping through bandages. Anders pressed his hand to the wound, whispering, "Hold on, just a little longer. You'll make it." The corporal's eyes, wide with pain, held onto the words as if they were lifelines. They moved like shadows, inching forward through drifts of snow taller than a man. Sleds snagged on ice-covered shrubs. Soldiers slipped, cursed, and fell, yet Anders never lost rhythm. Each fall was corrected, each groan acknowledged. He became the heartbeat of the group, a constant force pushing them forward. Hours stretched into a nightmare of white, cold, and fear. The wind sliced through layers of clothing, numbing faces, freezing tears on cheeks. Anders' fingers bled where they gripped ropes and sled handles, but he ignored it. Survival demanded relentless motion, endurance beyond thought. As they rounded a ridge, the enemy reappeared. Patrols had discovered their movement. Gunfire erupted across the snow, a staccato of death. Anders dropped low, pushing a sled into a shallow ditch for cover. Bullets spat over the frozen earth, tearing snow into clouds of dust and ice. He barked orders, coordinating movement with soldiers who were barely awake, barely conscious, barely alive. Every man carried someone else's weight. Every man was a lifeline. Anders' own breath burned in his lungs, his vision narrowed, his body screaming for rest. But still, he moved. He could not stop.
By late afternoon, the group reached a small stand of trees, a thin shelter from open exposure. Not much, but enough to regroup. Anders assessed his charges. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes for some. Others were delirious from blood loss. He worked quickly, improvising splints, wrapping limbs in layers of cloth, administering the last of the morphine sparingly. The sun dipped toward the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the snow. Anders looked at his ragged group, every face etched with pain, terror, and grim determination. 200 men had survived hours under fire, across frozen terrain, because he refused to stop. He whispered to himself, voice barely audible over the wind, "We're not done yet, not by far." In the distance, the faint glow of enemy flares rose. Anders' jaw tightened. The next stage of their journey would be even more perilous, through forests, across rivers frozen and cracking, with the enemy hunting them relentlessly. But he knew one truth, carved deep into his soul from the first day he treated the wounded. As long as he moved, as long as he cared, hope survived. He looked to the sky. Night would fall soon. Darkness, he knew, was both friend and enemy. They would have to march under it, fight under it, survive under it. And for the men depending on him, there was no other choice. The wind howled louder, rattling trees like bones. Anders' eyes met the weary gazes of his charges. Every step ahead was a gamble, every breath a victory. And still, he led them onward. The frozen wasteland waited. The storm of war was far from over. Night fell like a shroud over the forest. Snow whispered across the ground, drifting into drifts that swallowed footprints and sled tracks alike. Anders moved with the others, every step a struggle. Exhaustion clawed at muscles. Frostbitten fingers and toes burned with cold that no fire could chase away.
The group paused at the edge of a frozen river. Ice stretched wide, slick and treacherous. Below, water roared beneath the thin crust, hungry to claim anyone who misjudged a step. Anders knelt beside a wounded private, examining his frostbitten feet. The man groaned, teeth chattering violently. Anders' heart clenched. He had already used the last of his morphine. They were nearly halfway to the next safe point, and the enemy was not far behind. Recon patrols had likely spotted smoke from earlier fires. The wind carried distant gunfire, the faint echo of artillery, the occasional crack of a rifle. Each sound reminded Anders of the razor-thin line between survival and death. He scanned the group. 2 men were dragging more weight than their bodies could bear. One soldier fell to his knees, vomiting into the snow, delirious. Another slumped against a tree, unmoving, eyes glazed. Anders' stomach twisted. Every instinct screamed that he could not leave anyone behind, but the group's survival depended on speed, on moving forward. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of the war. "We keep going," he said softly, voice low but firm. "2 of you, stay here with the sled. Rotate every 10 minutes. I'll be back for you, if I can." The men protested, fear and loyalty in their voices. Anders clenched his jaw. "It's the only way. If we stop for everyone, we all die." Heart pounding, he led the main group across the ice. Every step was agony. Snow crunched under boots, the wind bit at exposed skin, and the dark water below threatened with every misstep. Behind him, the 2 soldiers struggled, shouting brief instructions, doing their best to keep the sled moving for the immobilized men. Halfway across, the ice groaned, a sinister sound that made Anders' stomach lurch. He froze. Then a crack split the night. Snow erupted, a man shouted, and a sled tilted dangerously. Anders leapt forward, gripping the edge of the sled and hauling it back to solid ground.
He dragged the wounded soldier away from the thin ice, heart racing. They reached the opposite bank by dawn. The first gray light of morning painted the forest in silver and blue. The cold was relentless, yet the group pressed onward. Anders stopped briefly, kneeling to check the wounded. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes for some. Hypothermia drained others. Anders' mind raced. Every decision carried weight. Every choice could mean death. He treated the wounded with trembling hands, improvising splints from tree branches, wrapping layers of cloth where bandages were gone, whispering words of reassurance he barely believed himself. Ahead lay the dense forest, a labyrinth of snow-laden trees and hidden dangers. Enemy patrols could be anywhere. Every mile forward was both salvation and torment. Anders looked at his charges, faces pale, eyes hollow, lips cracked from cold. 200 men, all depending on him. The weight of responsibility pressed down like the snow-laden branches overhead. He allowed himself a brief bitter thought. How many will make it? How many will survive my choices? But there was no time to dwell. The forest awaited, dark and endless, and the enemy was never far behind. Each step forward was a gamble, each breath a struggle. And yet, Anders led them, moving like a shadow through the snow, every action deliberate, every choice a balance between duty and desperation.
The frozen forest swallowed them, silence broken only by the wind, the groan of ice, the moans of the wounded. Anders' resolve hardened. He would not fail these men. Not tonight, not ever. And in the cold dawn light, one truth remained. Survival would demand every ounce of courage, every shred of humanity, and every moral compromise he could bear. The next stretch would test him as never before, and the storm of war was far from over. The forest pressed in around them, a wall of skeletal trees draped in snow. Every branch seemed alive, groaning under the weight of ice, each shadow a potential threat. Anders led the group forward, sleds creaking, men stumbling through the knee-deep snow, breaths puffing white into the frozen air. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed. Anders froze. His instincts screamed. Then another shot. A soldier fell, face down, snow spraying around him. The enemy had found them. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, scrambling for cover behind trees and snowdrifts. Anders dove to the ground, the cold biting through his uniform. His heart hammered, not just from fear, but from the weight of responsibility. Every life under his care was now on the line. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Anders yelled, his voice cutting through the gunfire. He grabbed a wounded private, dragging him behind a fallen tree. Around them, bullets pinged off ice, ricocheting like deadly hail. Anders assessed quickly. The ambush was small, a recon patrol, but they were strategically positioned across the narrow pass. Sleds were stuck, soldiers struggling. He had to make a decision, push forward under fire, or risk staying put, exposing everyone to prolonged danger. He barked orders. 2 men, suppressing fire. Others, drag the wounded down the side way. Move! The men obeyed, fear sharp in their eyes, yet Anders' resolve was sharper. He found cover behind a frozen log, peering at the enemy. Small, efficient, calculating, but they hadn't expected this level of organization, not from a ragged, frostbitten unit. Anders' mind raced. Improvisation was their only chance. Using snowbanks and fallen branches, he directed the men to create a staggered defensive line. Shots rang out, men ducked, groaned, cursed. Every second was a battle for survival, not just against the enemy, but against the cold that sapped strength and will. He saw Corporal Myers hit, sliding into the snow. Anders leapt, dragging him behind a tree, checking quickly, conscious, shaken, alive. No time to bandage him properly, not now. Survival first, healing second. Amid the chaos, Anders realized something vital. The sleds with the severely wounded were vulnerable. He sprinted across open ground, bullets whistling past, heart pounding, muscles screaming in protest. He reached the first sled,
pulling it behind a ridge of snow, helping two soldiers reposition. The enemy was relentless, but their numbers were small. Anders exploited every shadow, every dip in the snow. He moved like a phantom, every motion calculated. The wounded moaned beneath blankets, frozen fingers gripping his hands, eyes wide of terror and trust.
Minutes stretched like hours. Snow fell heavier, blanketing the scene, muting the sound of gunfire, turning the battlefield into a surreal white nightmare. Anders' voice rose above the storm, commanding, encouraging, demanding focus. Every order mattered. Every decision weighed heavily. Finally, the enemy faltered. Their line broke, retreating into the trees. Anders breathed, though relief was tempered by exhaustion and fear. The sleds were intact, the wounded alive. But the cost was etched on every face, frozen, exhausted, terrified. He looked around, heart sinking. Several men were missing from the immediate group, likely casualties or stragglers caught in the chaos. He would search for them, but first the priority was moving deeper into cover, into terrain that gave them a fighting chance. Anders gathered his strength, pushing through numbness, pain, and fear. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the wind, "We survive. We survive or we all die here." The forest stretched endlessly ahead, silent now, but treacherous. Every step forward was a gamble, every breath a test of endurance. And somewhere ahead, the makeshift hospital waited, a fragile bastion of hope amidst the frozen hell. The storm of bullets had passed, but the real battle was only beginning. The snow lay thick on the ground, muting every sound except the wind's low howl through the skeletal trees. Anders surveyed the small clearing ahead, a natural hollow, sheltered by ridges of ice-laden branches. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Every man, every sled, every breath counted now. He barked orders, his voice hoarse but steady. "Set up here, dig into the snow, make walls, stack branches, dig trenches if you have to. Keep the wounded out of the wind." Soldiers moved with shaking limbs, freezing fingers numbed by frostbite. Anders worked alongside them, hands raw, muscles aching, sweat freezing instantly into ice on his coat. He checked each wounded man as they arrived, improvising splints from branches, wrapping blankets soaked in snow around shivering bodies. It was brutal. Ammunition and food were scarce, and medical supplies nearly non-existent. Anders' kit consisted of a small bag of bandages, a few bottles of antiseptic, and whatever he had managed to scavenge from abandoned supply crates along the way. Yet he treated each injury with the same meticulous care he would in a proper hospital. Every bandage, every patch, every repositioned limb was a small victory. The men began calling it the Makeshift Hospital, a name whispered with both awe and disbelief. Snow mounds became beds, hollowed-out branches became partitions. Anders' voice rose above the moans of the wounded, the clatter of equipment, and the persistent whistle of the wind. "Hold on. Don't give up," he shouted, gripping a young private's hand as he stitched a ragged wound along the shoulder. "You'll see home again. You'll see your family." But home seemed impossibly far. Snow and ice surrounded them, and the forest felt like a cage. The wounded shivered violently, and Anders worked tirelessly, slipping into the rhythm of adrenaline and fear. Each man saved was a life wrested from the clutches of death, but every second spent meant the cold crept deeper, the wind cut sharper, and the threat of the enemy lingered. Night fell. Darkness swallowed the clearing, leaving only the faint glow of makeshift lanterns and fires dug into the snow. Anders huddled beside the weakest of the wounded, whispering reassurances while feverish bodies trembled. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every crack in the forest, every shadow beyond the circle of light, could signal danger. Hours turned into days. The wounded numbered over 200, each one a test of Anders' endurance and ingenuity. Rations dwindled, snow became water, branches and tarps were stretched, rearranged, fortified. He treated frostbite with whatever warmth he could provide, managed infections with crude antiseptic, and fought to maintain morale. And yet, in the midst of exhaustion and despair, small victories emerged. A soldier who had barely survived the ambush opened his eyes, whispered thanks. A bandaged man managed to sit upright for the first time, his trembling legs carrying him to the fire. Anders felt a glimmer of hope. But there was no rest. Rumors of enemy patrols reached them, carried on the wind like whispers of death. Anders knew they were not safe. Every moment was a balancing act between care and defense, warmth and vigilance, hope and the icy reality surrounding them. He paused, scanning the dimly lit clearing, the faces of men pale from cold, fear, and injury. His jaw tightened. "We survive," he muttered under his breath. "No matter what, we survive." Above them, the snow continued to fall. The forest seemed endless, the night unyielding, yet Anders' makeshift hospital held fast, a fragile, human island of life in a frozen, merciless world. And somewhere beyond the clearing, the enemy watched, waiting. The storm was far from over. The night air was a knife. Snow stung exposed skin. Every man at Anders' makeshift hospital moved silently, shadows among shadows, fires burning low to avoid detection. 200 wounded, cold, and frightened souls relied on him, and the enemy knew it. Anders' ears were tuned to the forest's subtle sounds. A branch snapping under weight, the faint crunch of boots over frozen snow. He had learned to distinguish between the wind's moan and something far more sinister. Tonight, the sound came. A distant rustle, growing closer, sharper. Anders froze. "Enemy," he whispered. Not a question, not a guess, a fact. He moved quickly, checking the perimeter. Soldiers scrambled, makeshift barricades hastily reinforced with sleds, logs, and anything solid. The wounded were ushered into snowbanks, hidden beneath tarps, murmuring prayers or groans of fear. Anders' hands shook, not from cold, but from the surge of adrenaline. Then came the first shots. A crack of rifles, a staccato of machine guns somewhere beyond the tree line. The enemy had found them. "Return fire! Hold them off!" Anders shouted. His voice cut through the night like a flare. Some soldiers obeyed, grabbing rifles from the fallen, firing blindly into the darkness. Others crouched behind their makeshift walls, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Chaos erupted. Snow sprayed like bullets across the clearing. Anders ran between the wounded, checking splints, covering bodies, moving them out of the line of fire when he could. Every life mattered. Every second was precious.
A shell of frozen earth exploded near the fires. Sparks flew. A soldier screamed, clutching a leg that had been shattered in an earlier skirmish. Anders ripped off a piece of cloth, pressed it tightly, whispering, "Stay with me. Stay with me." The enemy advanced. Shadows darted between trees, rifles flashing. Anders grabbed what few grenades they had left, tossing them with precision to halt the assault. His heart pounded, his breath came in short gasps, but he didn't falter. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time was meaningless. Anders fought with the relentless force of desperation, shouting orders, dragging men out of the snow, patching wounds in between bursts of fire. The wounded, the weak, did what they could, throwing rocks, hurling sticks, screaming to disorient the enemy. Fear and courage intertwined, binding them together. By dawn, the first rays of pale light filtered through the trees. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind a clearing littered with footprints, broken branches, and the frozen silence of what might have been death. Anders looked around. His body ached. His fingers were numb. His coat was soaked with blood, some his, some theirs. 200 men had survived. 200 lives clung to hope because of him. But the victory was hollow. Supplies were dangerously low. Fires had nearly gone out. The wind howled.
indifferent to human suffering. And the threat of the enemy remained. He sank to the snow, exhausted, breathing ragged. Around him, soldiers huddled, some whispering thanks, some simply shivering in silence. Anders closed his eyes briefly, imagining home, imagining warmth, then opened them, steeling himself. The war was not over. The storm was far from over. Anders knew one thing with certainty. He would not stop. Not now, not ever. The wind came first, a howl that seemed to rise from the very earth, tearing across the forest like a living thing. Snow fell in thick sheets, turning the world into a white void. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Anders' makeshift hospital, once a fragile refuge, was now trapped, isolated, at the mercy of both nature and the distant enemy.
Inside, the wounded huddled together under tarps and blankets, shivering violently. Anders moved between them, hands raw from the cold, lips blue, eyes burning from fatigue. Fires threatened to die, smoke curling weakly toward the low canopy. Every breath was a struggle. Every heartbeat echoed in the frozen stillness. He checked supplies. Rations were minimal. Bandages nearly gone. Morphine only enough for a few. Yet he could not surrender. 200 men depended on him. Each life a fragile thread, holding the web of hope together. The storm grew stronger. Roofs of snow weighed heavily on makeshift shelters. The trees groaned, some collapsing under the weight, smashing into their temporary wards. Anders leapt into action, pulling men from under timber, reinforcing walls with sleds and crates. Fear lingered, but courage surged. Hours became days. Sleep was a memory. Food was a memory. Only the relentless drive to keep his men alive remained. Anders improvised. He melted snow over fires for water, cut cloth to stretch his bandages, even shared his own meager rations without hesitation. Then came the distant, terrifying sound. Wolves, drawn to the scent of the wounded, howled hungrily at the edge of the camp. Soldiers panicked, but Anders stood firm. He shouted orders, banging makeshift metal rods together, guiding men to form a protective circle. Fear fought the courage in their eyes, but they obeyed. Survival required discipline, even against beasts. On the fourth night, when the storm's fury seemed endless, the distant rumble of engines reached Anders' ears. Relief. The Allied rescue convoy had broken through, cutting through the blizzard like a knife. Men cried, some laughing, some silent with disbelief. Anders helped the last wounded into sleds, guiding them toward salvation with the hand that had never trembled. As the convoy carried the survivors away from the white hell, Anders stood in the snow, watching the forest behind him. 200 men, sons, husbands, brothers, lived because he refused to stop, because courage had outweighed exhaustion, because determination had conquered despair. He knew the war would continue. He knew others would face similar trials. But here, in this frozen hell, a makeshift hospital had become a fortress of hope, a testament to what one person could do against impossible odds. And as the storm finally began to ebb, and the convoy disappeared into the horizon, Anders allowed himself a rare moment of quiet. A single thought echoed in his mind. The lives we save, they carry on, and that is enough. The storm had ended, but the legacy of courage, sacrifice, and endurance would never fade.